Introduce again our special guest today, Richard Viladesau from Fordham University, and also to thank Jed Geierhunt for bringing him to us.
Yay,
right?
Jed. Jed rocks.
So I'm going to run upstairs and get something for him to write on.
Oh.
But go ahead and
Thank you.
start.
The topic that was suggested to me was salvation of the other, salvations of those who are outside of our own faith community. And one of my specializations is teaching the world religions. So it would be more interesting to speak not so much about salvation of non-Christians, which I think most of us kind of take for granted in the contemporary world, but the question of whether we Christians can be saved from the standpoint of other religions. Let's start with a little personal remembrance. Some years ago, I was visiting a friend in Tunisia, and he was living in a Muslim quarter, living in a cave, actually, in a small Muslim town. He himself was a Christian, although I'm not sure, at that time he might have been a Buddhist. He went through a whole lot of changes in his life. But anyway, one day we decided that we were going to go to visit a little Berber village that was across the desert. A whole day's walk across the desert. This is not the, you mustn't imagine Lawrence of Arabia. This was not the, the Sahara Kabira, they call it the Great Sand Desert. This is the, what they call the Sahara Skrira, the dry, rocky desert of, along the coast of North Africa. So anyway, we were going to go here, and it happened that this was during the time of Ramadan, when Muslims can't eat from sunrise to sunset. And because my friend was living among Muslims, he was keeping Ramadan. Now, fortunately, we got up after sunrise, so that meant that we could not eat or drink all day. And we were walking through this desert, and we had been walking for about 6 hours, and we realized that we were just not going to make it in this condition. So fortunately, my friend knew a little village where he was acquainted with some people, and we went to this little village, and he asked the man in the house who was not working because it was Ramadan. I asked him, did they have something that we could eat, and especially could they give us some water to drink? So the man invited us into his house, and the house was really tiny. It was maybe a little bit more than the size of the area taken up by these tables. The man lived there with his wife and 5 children. This was a kind of adobe house, it's just North Africa, no running water, no electricity, nothing. So he said, yes, of course he would give us something to eat. And he went first and he closed all of the shutters of the house so that nobody would see. And then he brought out, put on a little table, all the food that they had in the house, which was a pita and some olives and dates and a glass of water. They only owned one glass, so we had to share the glass with the water. And so we're standing there hungrily eating and drinking, and the man and his family are all gathered around us. And my friend, who spoke Arabic, I spoke only a very, very little bit, my friend spoke it well. My friend said to the man and his wife, well, here we are eating in front of your whole family, won't you have something with us? And the man was horrified. He said, no, absolutely not. It's Ramadan. I don't want to go to hell. So my friend said, well, you've given us food. What about us? He said, oh, it's okay for you. You're going to go to hell anyway. And the thing is that he meant it. wasn't a joke. He was convinced that because we were not Muslims, we were predestined for hell. Didn't prevent him from being nice to us, but he was just convinced that we, like all non-Muslims, were just predestined to hell. Somewhat along the same lines, when we went back to the city of Tunis, and one day we were just standing there looking at things, and a couple of kids came up to us, young teenagers, I would say. And they said to us in Arabic, "You're foreigners, aren't you?" Yes. So they said, "Listen to what we're saying and repeat this after us." And they said, "La ilaha illallah Muhammadan Rasulullah," which is the profession of faith, the Muslim profession of faith. And they wanted us to say those words, to repeat those words after them, because by doing so, we would become Muslims. If you say the Shahada in front of witnesses, you're a Muslim. At least so they thought. A Muslim theologian would tell you, no, you have to mean the words. You can't just say that. But these kids didn't understand that. So they just wanted us, just out of the blue, they wanted us to repeat these words so that our souls would be saved. By doing that, we'd become Muslims and we could be saved. They were actually saving us from damnation. Another little story, this one taken from history. When Mehmed II conquered Constantinople in 1453, the city of Constantinople refused to surrender, refused his offers of peace. And according to Sharia, to Islamic law, if a non-Muslim community is hostile and they refuse to surrender, you have to give them 3 chances to surrender. And after that, you can treat them as idolaters and pagans. So the emperor in Constantinople refused all of the offers of peace. So after 3 days, Mehmed sent a message to the emperor saying, well, you realize now, as far as we're concerned, you are all kafirs, you're all unbelievers. And we can treat you as unbelievers, that is, I will massacre everyone in the city. But the Grand Mufti, the chief religious authority, who had been appointed by Mehmed himself, said to him, no, you can't do that, you can't do that. These are Christians and Jews living in the city. They're people of the book. They're protected by the Quran. You can't massacre them. So Mehmed relented, and he invaded the city, but he didn't massacre all of the inhabitants. But in return, he made a vow to God that he would behead 70,000 Bektashi Sufis. The Bektashis, of course, were Muslims. But because they were Sufis of this particular sect, they were considered by Orthodox Muslims to be heretics. So while he spared the Christians and Jews, he had his troops go about and gather up all of the Bektashi Muslims and beheaded them. He actually couldn't find 70,000 Bektashis, so he actually had his troops go out and chop the tops off the memorials to them in the cemeteries, the stones in the cemetery, until he had actually gotten 70,000 beheadings, as he had promised. So, the question of the salvation of the other is a little bit complicated. Who's the other? To Mehmed, the Bektashi Sufis, who were Muslims, were more other than Christians and Jews, because they were people of the book. Different sects, of course, and different religions have different interpretations of what constitutes our community and who's inside and who's outside our community. And most religions recognize that the distinction between good and bad, holy and sinful, cuts across traditions and religions. And of course, the subject that I'm talking on is made even more complicated by the fact that people don't agree about what salvation is. If you ask, can people be saved? What do you mean by saved? Buddhist nirvana, or Buddhist becoming Buddha, is not the same as the Christian vision of God. And of course, these differences occur not only among religions, but within religions. Buddhists don't agree with each other about what the final goal of existence is. Hindus don't agree with each other about what the final goal is. So, for my purposes, I'm just going to talk about salvation in a very, very general sense of reaching the goal, whatever you think that goal happens to be, just reaching the goal. Can anyone other than us, whoever us happens to be, reach the goal? Obviously, as you would expect, within the religious traditions, you find the same kind of diversity on these questions as you find within Christianity. There are those who take a very wide view, universalists you might say, and there are those who take a very narrow view, particularists or exclusivists. We should also remark in a preliminary way that the question of the salvation of others is very different from the question of the tolerance of others. We find many religious traditions that are extremely tolerant of other religions, but don't think that they can be saved. So, what I intend to do is to just give a few examples of how the question is treated. Obviously, our time is very limited, so I'm not going to give any kind of vast survey, but just give a few examples of this question of us and the other, and can the other be saved? Probably the most inclusive view that you find is represented by the Sufi tradition in Islam. The Sufis think of salvation in terms, you might say, you might diagram it in terms of three concentric circles. At the very center, you have the real, the true, God, Hakika, it's called Al-Haq, the real, the true. The closest circle to the center is Islam, the Sharia. But there's another circle beyond that, which is not Sharia, but Shara'i. And this is revealed religion in general, all the other religions. And beyond that, there's yet another wider circle, the most inclusive circle, which is natural knowledge of God. And all three of these are means to God for the Sufis. The most direct route is by the Sharia. Other people who are in other religions have got kind of twisted notions of the Sharia. And it's very hard to get from natural knowledge to Sharia. It's possible, but it's very hard. However, for the Sufis, there's another way. Not just Sharia, but there's also what they call tariqah, the way. Namely, the way of direct contact with God. And you can engage in this from any of the circles, an absolutely direct route to God, from anywhere where you happen to be, by a kind of interior experience of God, no matter where you occur in the circles of revealed religions. This was a point of view that was very predominant in Sufi circles and in Muslim philosophical circles. There's a famous book written by, or it was a famous book, written by the philosopher Ibn Tufayl, in the 12th century. He was a Spanish Muslim. He wrote a book that was called Hayy ibn Yaqzan, which means alive, the alive one, Hayy, the son of Ibn Yaqzan, the awakened one. And it's a story of a child, small child, baby, who is in a shipwreck and gets left on a desert, an uninhabited island where there are only animals. It's kind of Mowgli story. And the child is brought up by the animals with no contact with human beings. And years later, there's another shipwreck, and a guy lands on the island who is a Muslim mufti, scholar of the Sharia. And they eventually learn to speak a common language. And the mufti realizes, to his great surprise, that this fellow living alone on the island with the animals has by himself come up with the entire content of the Quran. Well, the entire content, no, but everything that the Sufis thought was important about the Quran, which excluded almost all of the externals. For them, what it's really about is this way, this interior way to God. And you can get there from nature, from the natural knowledge of God. Similarly, there was a rather large Muslim community in China in the Middle Ages and up into modern times. Even today, there are many Muslims living within the borders of what's today China. But in those days, even in the capital cities, there were large Muslim populations. And there was even a large intellectual group, the Han Kitab, as they were called. They were Muslim scholars who spoke Chinese. And one of them wrote a very, very famous book in which he says, he's a Muslim, he's a believing Muslim, and he's writing this book for Muslims, and he says, the contents of the Quran are no different, and he actually says that, are no different from what is taught in the Confucian classics. So here we have a highly universalistic, highly Catholic, universal view of salvation. But how common is this view? In Sunni orthodoxy, Sufism has always been rather suspect, and this very universalist view has been rather suspect. So Muslims today are still asking the question, non-Sufi Muslims are still asking the question, can non-Muslims enter paradise and not go to hell? And you can even find discussion of this on blogs, on the internet. These discussions back and forth are still going on among Muslims. And Orthodox Islam, unlike Sufism, wants to find all of the answers in the Quran and in the Hadith, in the traditions going back to Muhammad. And unfortunately, the Quran on this point, as on many points, seems to be contradictory. So, in Surah number 2, we find the Quran saying, truly, those who believed, that is, Muslims, or those who believe, and the Jews, and the Christians, and the Sabaeans, whoever believes in Allah and the last day, and performs righteous good deeds, shall have their reward with the Lord. On them there shall be no fear, and they shall not grieve. So it seems a very clear statement of salvation, at least of the people of the book. Muslims, Christians, Jews. But then we find in Surah number 5 a statement, truly they have disbelieved who say, behold, behold, God is the Christ, the Son of Mary. Seeing that Christ himself said, O children of Israel, worship me alone, who is my sustainer as well as your sustainer. So in the Quran, Jesus says, Ana Muslim, I am a Muslim. In the Quran, Jesus is a Muslim. That is, one who makes submission to God. That's what Islam is, submission to God. So before the coming of Muhammad, all of the righteous, all of the prophets were Muslims. They were kind of anonymous Muslims because they submitted to God. And Jesus also is a Muslim. He teaches Islam. He teaches submission to God. But behold, Jesus says this, behold, anyone who ascribes divinity to any being beside God, unto him God will deny paradise, and his abode shall be the fire, and such evildoers will have none to aid them. And again we're told in the 3rd surah, whoever seeks a religion other than Islam, it will never be accepted. And in the hereafter, he will be one of the losers. Again, we have a contradiction, or a seeming contradiction anyway, which Muslims try to reconcile in one way or another. The usual way of reconciling this is by what I said a moment ago, that those who lived before Muhammad and were righteous people could be saved outside of Islam because Islam had not been preached. But once Islam had been preached, there's only one way, which is the explicit recognition not only that there is one God, but that Muhammad is the prophet. On the other hand, while that's kind of the standard Sunni Orthodox position, there are others who will say, and this is something I took from a blog online, non-Muslims who have never heard the message of Islam are known as al-Fatra. And God says, again in the Quran, we would not punish unless we sent a messenger to give warning. So, no, they won't be punished because they haven't heard the message. So they haven't given the warning. They haven't had the warning, so God will not punish them. On the other hand, another blogger on this same question says, some polemicists will play semantic games with words like Islam, describing it simply as submission to God, in order to make it appear that the 3rd surah allows for a Jew or a Christian to be saved. However, correct commentaries are much more forthright, and they interpret the Quran more honestly. Islam teaches that non-Muslims cannot be saved. So we have here 3 very distinct opinions. One, before the coming of Muhammad, anybody could be saved, but afterwards, no. Afterwards, only those who have heard and responded to the message. And that is a position that many Christians took also up until the 20th century about Christianity. Or secondly, the universalist opinion that people can be implicit Muslims by worshiping God, even by natural religion, without becoming explicit Muslims. Or thirdly, and this is a widely held opinion in Islam, we don't know. And that also is based upon the Quran. Because there's another verse in the Quran that says, as to those who follow other ways, leave them be. At the end, Allah will sort them out. Obviously, with Islam, there's another question, which is the question of predestination. Some people are predestined, directly predestined to hell. That's the common opinion in Sunni Islam, and it raises a whole host of other questions, which there's not time to go into here. So let me pass now to another tradition, another one that's very widespread in the world today and becoming more and more popular in the world today, namely Buddhism. Can non-Buddhists, from a Buddhist point of view, can non-Buddhists be saved? Well, actually there has to be a prior question. Can Buddhists be saved? We had when I was teaching in the seminary, we had a lecturer come to introduce the students to Theravada Buddhism, the modern version of what's sometimes called Hinayana Buddhism, the stricter, smaller way of Buddhism that's taught in Southeast Asia, except for Vietnam. And he spoke to the students, gave the students all of the basics about Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, and what you have to do to reach nirvana. And afterwards there was a question period. And one of the students raised his hand. He said, there's something I don't understand. You said that in order to reach nirvana, you have to lead an ascetical life, you have to follow the Eightfold Path, you have to practice celibacy lifelong, you can't be married, and you have to be a monk. And I said, yes, that's right. He said, but you told us that you're married, and you have children, and you're a physicist, you're not a monk. So how are you going to reach nirvana? And the man said, I'm not. Not in this lifetime. Buddhism takes for granted, like Hinduism, that you have many lifetimes. And eventually you will be lucky enough to be reborn at a high enough state so that you can live a celibate life and become a monk and enter nirvana. But in a sense, there's an even more radical question about the salvation of even the Buddhist. In the Diamond Sutra, we read a famous statement where the Lord Buddha, who has become a bodhisattva, has taken a vow to save all sentient beings. He says, and yet, after I have delivered immeasurable beings, not one single being has been delivered. And why? Because if a bodhisattva had any idea of belief in a being, he could not be called a bodhisattva. That is, someone who's fit to become a Buddha. There does not exist the idea of a being, nor does there exist the idea of quality, or dharma, or non-quality. If there existed for these noble-minded bodhisattvas the idea of quality, then they would believe in a self. They would believe in a being. But all qualities must be abandoned. Much more, no qualities. So, from the point of view of the wisdom tradition in Buddhism, nobody is saved. Nobody. Because there is nobody. The self is an illusion. The self is a construction of our minds. So there are no selves to be saved. Or to put it another way, you're already in nirvana. It's just a matter of recognizing it. Of course, this is a very theological or Buddhological point of view. In ordinary Buddhist belief, things are somewhat more simple. There is an ultimate salvation, and it consists in becoming Buddha. This is the basic idea in most of Mahayana Buddhism, the larger tradition, Chinese Buddhism especially. But how do you become a Buddha? Well, it's a very difficult process, and it takes many rebirths. Gautama himself seems to have thought that you could reach nirvana in a single lifetime. But the later Buddhist tradition says that he just taught that because people were unable to face the truth, were unable to face the reality. This was upaya. This was accommodating the message to the audience. And so he gave them this lesser goal, the goal of nirvana, the goal of reaching peace. But actually, the Mahayana scriptures reveal that that's not the real goal. The real goal is actually to become Buddha yourself, the ultimate union with the Buddha nature. You can, of course, get to heaven, to the Pure Lands, where many Buddhas live. You can do that within a single lifetime. But you're still not saved. That's not salvation. That's just a transitory goal. So heaven is not eternal. Heaven is just a transitory goal on the way to Buddhahood. How long does it take to actually get to be a Buddha? Well, Orthodox Chinese Buddhism, very well expounded in this book called Orthodox Chinese Buddhism by a Zen master, Sheng Yen, explains that it takes 3 immeasurable kalpas to become a Buddha. It's hard to calculate exactly how long an immeasurable kalpa is. But as near as I can figure, it's about 1 million years. So, yes, you have hopes of becoming a Buddha if you can wait for 1 million years and go through several million rebirths in order to get there. We find a very similar doctrine taught also in Hinduism, in classical theistic Hinduism. So there's a great passage in the Bhagavad Gita, which is the great scripture for most theistic Hindus, where Vishnu, in the person of Krishna, reveals himself. And he says to Arjuna, the prince to whom he's revealing himself, he says, the whole universe is deluded by these 3 states of mind, the 3 gunas, which are being, finite being, and action, and darkness. So the whole universe is deluded by these 3 states of mind, developed from the qualities, and does not know me, because I am beyond them and inexhaustible. So he is Vishnu, he is the absolute God. But, he says, anyone who does good acts of the 4 classes actually worships me. And these are the 4 classes of acts by which you worship God, whether you know it or not. One who seeks after knowledge. One who is distressed. Suffering is the worshiping of God, even if you don't realize it. One who desires wealth. It's a way of worshiping God. And one who is possessed of knowledge. Those are the 4 acts by which you worship God, whether you realize it or not. Of these, the one who is possessed of knowledge, who is always devoted, and the one whose worship is addressed to one being only, is the highest. So they're not all equal ways of reaching God. There's a higher way of reaching God, which is devotion to Vishnu, explicit religion. But you can also be saved in these other ways. However, the Bhagavad Gita, like the Quran and like the Buddhist scriptures, contains contradictions, and like the Bible too. So, on the one hand, Krishna says, whichever form of deity any worshipper wishes to worship with faith, I will render his faith steady. So, Vishnu says he accepts the worship that's offered to other gods too. He says explicitly, they make sacrifices to other gods, but I am the receiver of all of the sacrifices. Because there's only one real God, so it doesn't matter whether you're worshiping Ganesh or Lakshmi. All worship goes to the real God anyway. God accepts all worship as coming to him or her. But then, he says right after that, but the fruit obtained by these people who have little judgment is perishable. Those who worship the divinities go to the divinities. Those who worship me come to me. I am unperceived, but become perceptible. I am not manifest to everybody. This deluded world does not know me, unborn and inexhaustible. But those who rest on me, who worship Vishnu, know the Brahman. They know the absolute being. So again, we find differences of opinion. On the one hand, all worship actually goes to Vishnu, and Vishnu accepts even unconscious worship, seeking knowledge, suffering, seeking wealth. These are all forms of worship of God. But they're not all equal, and in some passages the Gita says quite explicitly that if you worship one of the lesser deities, that's where you end up. You end up with the lesser deities. Whereas only those who worship Vishnu actually have the vision of Vishnu, go to Vishnu and are united with Vishnu. That same idea, by the way, also occurs in Mahayana Buddhism. According to Mahayana Buddhism, to Orthodox Mahayana Buddhism, the only true way of salvation is following the Dharma of Buddha. Those who follow other dharmas can be saved in a relative way. Those who worship Brahma, they get success in the world. Those who worship Vishnu or the Christian God will go to God after their death. But that God is still within the world of samsara. That God is still within the world of illusion. Only those who hear the Dharma of Buddha and live it can actually attain the genuine goal, which is to become Buddha. You don't hear that much from Buddhists because Buddhists have this principle of upaya, that you always preach to every audience according to their capacities. So it's very, very interesting. If you read speeches by the Dalai Lama that he gives in America to American audiences, they sound extremely universalist. If you hear speeches that the Dalai Lama gives to his community of Tibetan Buddhists, he says very clearly, nobody can be saved but a Buddhist. Nobody can be saved in the sense of becoming Buddha. They can be saved relatively. Yes, you can get to heaven, but that heaven is still within this deluded world of suffering. The Buddhists consider the God of Christians to be like the God of Hinduism or the God of Islam, to be a lesser conception of God. And if that's what you worship, that's where you go when you finish your time in samsara. But Mahayana Buddhists also say that about Hinayana Buddhists. Yes, you can attain nirvana, but nirvana is not really the goal. That was just something that Buddha taught because of the hard-heartedness of his audience. Real salvation can only be by the Mahayana way. Of course, we find in all of these traditions a modern form that, just as in Christianity, has embraced a very wide-reaching universalism. This was represented in Hinduism, for example, by Gandhi, who said, well, of course, taking the words of the Gita, the positive words of the Gita about other religions, of course, all worship goes to Vishnu. All religions are part of one great universal religion. Hinduism is the best example of it, but all of the other religions are also means of salvation. And the basic principle is right action, correct action. And this for Gandhi was the Sanatana Dharma, the universal, the eternal Dharma, the eternal teaching, that like the idea of a universal philosophy, a kind of common philosophy, a natural knowledge of God, is found in philosophical traditions as well. So, we're coming close to the time for conclusion if I'm going to leave some time for questions. Obviously, we find in the other religions, just as in Christianity, we find instances of inclusivism, exclusivism, and agnosticism. We just don't know. That's particularly true in Judaism. The attitude of Judaism is, in general, Judaism is salvation for the Jews. As for everybody else, that's up to God. We know the way for us. is Judaism. The rest of the world, that's God's affair, just as the Quran also says in some places. The final word, of course, for anybody has got to be in the mystery of God, or in the mystery of being, for those who don't affirm a God. The fourth Eucharistic prayer that in the Roman Catholic Church prays for all those who have died, and says explicitly, whose faith you alone have known. In other words, Christianity is not identified with faith. Only God knows whether people have faith. And also says, you have helped all people to seek and to find you. The idea that God helps all people to seek God is not new, but the idea that God helps all people actually to find God, that's the first time that occurs in a liturgical prayer, in an official prayer, that all people are able actually to find God, no matter where they stand in their religion. For Christians, obviously, God is love, and therefore there's a universal salvific will. And perhaps most importantly, that it's universal not just extensively, but also intensively. Not only that God loves all people of all kinds, but God loves all people at all times, even sinners. And it seems to me that in the last analysis, the practical answer to the question about salvation is, our attitude should be like God's. Inclusive, the attitude of love extensively, but also, very importantly, intensively. That is, willing to forgive the sinner also, even those who seem to be on the wrong path. Okay, I think I have to end here, but I will be willing if anyone wants to stay around for some minutes more, I'd be willing to entertain any questions. Entertain the questions, not necessarily answer them.
It was a really wonderful and thought-provoking talk. I have one comment, or one observation, one question. It seems to me that in modern times, religious beliefs get overlaid with geographic and political struggles, so that a China which a few hundred years ago would have harbored a Muslim community now persecutes the Christian church. And that one of the complications of having a holy book which is full of contradictions means that a society under pressure will single out not the most universalist and tolerant of its beliefs, but the most exclusivist and intolerant, so that we have struggle amongst churches. And I know a little bit about world religions, particularly about Islam, but I'm not going to go there at the moment. But traditionally, there's been a demarcation between Judeo-Christian traditions, which precisely because they come out of a belief in God loving everybody and in the human individual and the concept of personal sin, which differentiates that tradition from the rest of the world. And of course, that gets overlaid with political ideas about democracy, liberty, and so on and so forth. Do you think that that distinction still holds? And are you optimistic that the rise of fundamentalist versions of whatever religion will, in the fullness of time, be overcome?
Good question. Well, to the last part of the question, I would say I hope so. Whether I'm optimistic or not, maybe in the long run I'm optimistic. In the short run, I don't know. Precisely because of what you said, as you remarked very insightfully, in times of difficulty, religions, like other institutions, become defensive. They become self-defensive. And particularly when they feel themselves threatened, frequently they want to emphasize what's distinct, what distinguishes us, what makes us a community over against the others. So I think that's what is to a large extent happening in the world. You know, not just in Christianity, where fundamentalism has become so significant, especially in this country, but in India, for example, where there's a strong Hindu fundamentalism. that's been resurgent. In India, where at one time it was kind of the example, Hindu thought, and it was the example of tolerance. But this fundamentalism as a Muslim, in Buddhism also, you have these intra-sectarian disputes with one form proclaiming itself better than the other forms, or even the name Mahayana, saying we're the great form of Buddhism, and you others, you're the Hinayana, you're the little form of Buddhism. So I think your remark was very much to the point. It's very, very hard to say. I can see both tendencies going on in the world today. And I think that ironically, one of the big promoters of a more inclusivist point of view in the West has been the Enlightenment, the secular Enlightenment, or the natural knowledge of God. Many of the principles that some of the religions are only now beginning to recognize, universality, gender equality, they didn't come from the Bible, they came from the European Enlightenment. And I think often religions don't want to acknowledge that because they want to say, everything came from our revelation. So I think also you pointed out a very big difference between the Western traditions and the Eastern traditions on this question of person. Is there value to a person and to the person who exists here and now in the world? It's sort of like, in the great Eastern traditions, in Hinduism and Buddhism, the main line of thought is that nobody meets God until they're ready. And that may take millions of years. Whereas in Christianity, and Judaism, and Islam, it's kind of like hide and seek. Ready or not, here I come. You die and you're meeting God. Ready or not. I think that modern science has, to a certain extent, influenced the Eastern belief, to a certain extent, on an intellectual level. So you'll now find Japanese Buddhists, who are the ones generally who are the most sophisticated intellectually. You'll now find Japanese Buddhists saying, well, we have to drop this whole stuff of karma and rebirth. That just doesn't hold up in a modern scientific worldview. You have others like the Dalai Lama who say, oh no, this is perfectly in accord with my modern scientific worldview. But I think that there are tendencies, again, this is because of the secularization that's taken place in Japan and the influence of not only the Western Enlightenment, but the Chinese Enlightenment also, and the Japanese Enlightenment. So I think that there is, to a certain extent, a convergence around the idea of rationality and around the idea of a human community. And I think we can only hope that's the direction that it will go in.
What's the difference between submit and loving your God with all your heart and all your mind?
Well, that's a good question. You see, and a Muslim might answer that very, very differently. Different Muslims answer that very, very differently. The Quran presumes that one is going to love God, but the emphasis is that you have to submit to God. And in a sense, that's considered to be God's mercy. So modern Muslim commentators say, they revere Jesus. Jesus taught this absolute love of God. And Muslims will say, mainstream Muslims will say, yes, that's right. But only Jesus could do it. We human beings can't be Jesus. So that's why Jesus was a great prophet. But we're not. God is merciful to us, so he doesn't demand of us the standards of Jesus. That's why Muslims say Christians always end up being hypocrites, because they have this tremendous ideal of the love of God, and you can't practice it. Muslims say that Islam is much more realistic. It gives you rules to follow. And that's the way that you have to be saying. But again, there's not agreement about that. In the Hadith, which are the sayings of Muhammad, and of course different Muslims accept different collections of Hadith. In the Hadith, there's one saying of Muhammad where a man comes to Muhammad and he asks him, if I obey the precepts of the law, just the question of if I just obey the precepts of the law and submit to Allah and do just what's required, will I get to heaven? And Muhammad says, yes. Yes, you don't have to do anything beyond what's required. But then there's another hadith in a different part of the hadith which almost quotes Matthew's gospel, where God says, suppose I'm hungry, or suppose your neighbor is hungry and you don't give him to eat, you've denied me. And he goes to that whole list of things. You know, I think whoever wrote this hadith, if it comes from Muhammad himself, must have had the gospel of Matthew. Matthew 25 in the back of his mind. And in that hadith it becomes clear, no, it's not enough to do the minimum. You have to love with your whole heart and your whole soul. So, there's no single answer. Just as we find in Christianity, is this an all-encompassing, all-absorbing love of God, or do you basically obey the rules and hope that that's the way to get to heaven? I think we find basically the same thing in Islam. They disagree. Of course, the Sufis would say, no, the whole heart of the Sharia is the love of God, and all of the rest is secondary. But the Sufis are regarded by many as suspect, if not actually unorthodox. Other questions or remarks?
I never knew that much about Islam, and I'm going back to a very recent thing, sort of from 9/11, actually. And there's such a division there for the Islamists who say we're about peace, not what happened that day, and others is jihad. You know, that's one of the extremes within. Is there a real Islam, or is it just like everything else?
Well, it's like other religions. I mean, the Salafi Muslims claim that theirs is the real Islam, and that whole movement in Islam, the Wahhabi movement, came about precisely as a revolt against Sufism. So they are reactionaries. They are reacting against the liberal currents in Islam. I had a sermon that was given in Germany by a Salafi preacher, one of these extremist Islamist preachers, and he was saying to his congregation in the mosque, mostly young people, mostly young men, he said, "Your grandfather came here to Germany for a better life and tried to be a Muslim here in the West, and he couldn't do it. He couldn't be a good Muslim living in the West. So your grandfather's Islam disappeared. And you said, that's a good thing, because your grandfather's Islam was full of Sufism and superstition. And I will now tell you the real way of Islam, which was exactly this extremist creed of restoring the caliphate, salvation only for those who are explicit Muslims, a jihad, a state of jihad against all of those who live in the Dar al-Harb. The Dar al-Harb is the Dar al-Islam is the house of Islam. Islam means submission. It also means Islam is related also to salam, peace. So the house of Islam is the house of peace. Everybody else, we all live in the Dar al-Harb, the house of warfare, where actual warfare is permitted. Muslims are not supposed to make warfare against each other, but in the Dar al-Harb, it's permitted. But on the other hand, who's a Muslim? There's a strong tradition in Islam that says the sinner is not a Muslim. So, you're a Sunni Muslim and your neighbor is let's say, a Sufi or even a Shiite Muslim, well, he's a sinner. So he's not really a Muslim. So it's okay to make warfare against him, because he's not really a Muslim. So you get this, and Americans coming back from Iraq who went in there very naive, not even knowing that there were Sunnis and Shiites in the world, come back hearing people like in the police force saying, that guy is not even a human being, he's a Shiite. Again, it's this, as you were saying, this intense competitiveness coming out of defensiveness. So that people who for centuries have lived together peacefully, all of a sudden become enemies because of the breakdown of the political situation, obviously, but also because of these sectarian animosities that they resuscitate. Well, I thank you very much for coming today.